Welcome back, subscribers. It's been so long since we last saw each other. So today we'll be talking about 21.4 of Campbell, which talks about how evolution affects populations. So natural selection is the only type of the three that were discussed in 21.3 that causes adaptive evolution consistently. So evolution by natural selection is partially chance and partially sorting. The new genetic variations that arise by chance. Those are your random mutations that occur in a population. But there is some sorting that takes place that is not random. The beneficial alleles, the ones that help you survive and reproduce, kind of get filtered out, and those are the ones that are favored in natural selection. So that is the only process by which we can get adaptive evolution, where we have an increase in the number of alleles that are beneficial to survival and reproduction, that improve fitness. Natural selection brings about adaptive evolution by acting on that organism's phenotype. If its phenotype is more beneficial, then it's going to continue to survive and reproduce. Survival of the fittest mentality is a little misleading, and so is the struggle for existence, because natural selection does not involve individuals directly competing against each other, but it's rather more about the relative fitness of an organism. So how fit are you to survive and reproduce compared to the guy or people next to you? This is also taking into account the contribution that an individual will make to the gene pool of the next generation compared to the contributions of the other individuals in the population. And selection will favor certain genotypes by acting on the beneficial phenotypes. So by choosing the phenotypes that survive and reproduce better, you then are going to be selecting for the genotypes that result in those phenotypes. There are three modes of natural selection. So we've got directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. I'll explain them here, and then on the next slide, we'll look at some pictures. So directional selection is a type of selection where the conditions favor individuals at one end of the spectrum or another of the phenotypic range. So if we look here, we could see directional selection if we have the solid line is the original population, the dotted line is the evolved population. Maybe we're going to move, instead of having white mice or kind of brown mice, we're going to move to more dark colored mice, all at this end of the spectrum. So we're moving in one direction. Therefore, we're selecting against the other side, the lighter color mice. So that's directional selection. Disruptive selection occurs when conditions favor individuals at both phenotype extremes, but maybe the in-betweener, sometimes the heterozygote, is selected for against. So here's disruptive. Our original population, we have some dark, some light, a lot in between. But now after a certain event, over time, we're selecting against the medium, and we're either favoring the all white or the all dark mouse. That's disruptive. And then the third type is stabilizing. And this occurs when the conditions favor the intermediate and act against the extreme. So stabilizing is kind of the opposite of disruptive. So in stabilizing, we're going to get rid of these extreme ones, no darks, no lights, and go for the middle. And that would be the most successful. So those are kind of the three ways natural selection can evolve in a population. Natural selection plays an important role in adaptive evolution because certain adaptations that are beneficial will continue to arise and become more common due to natural selection. For example, certain snakes have an adaptation that allows them to really stretch out their jaw and move their jaw, you can see here, and that will allow them to eat prey that's even larger than their head, which is crazy. But those snakes obviously have an advantage over snakes that cannot eat those things. Natural selection increases the frequencies of alleles that enhance survival and reproduction. And then adaptive evolution occurs when those individuals continue to increase in the population because they're passing on those beneficial traits. But because the environment can change at a moment's notice, adaptive evolution is a continuous dynamic process. So, what does that mean? It means that we're never going to get a perfect organism. There's never such thing as perfect. It's only in that environment, in that time, certain organisms have traits that are more beneficial than others. Genetic drift and gene flow are a lot more random, and they do not they do not respond to what's going on in the environment. So they can increase or decrease fitness for an organism's environment, but it's natural selection that acts on those changes that decides who is better suited. But the changes that result from genetic drift and gene flow are random. They're not a direct result of the environment in the way natural selection is. Balancing selection occurs when natural selection maintains stable frequencies of two or more phenotype forms in a population. So there's two examples here. One is heterozygote advantage, and the other is frequency dependent selection. So we've talked a lot about the heterozygote advantage. This occurs when the heterozygotes have a higher fitness than the homozygotes. So natural selection maintains two alleles at that locus. And the reason why I said we've talked about this a lot is because you're very familiar with sickle cell. This causes deleterious mutations in the hemoglobin, resulting in sickle cell. But if you're the heterozygote, you also have some malaria resistance. So we've talked a lot about sickle cell anemia at the molecular level already. We've talked about how on the chromosome for normal hemoglobin, we have thymine at this point on the DNA, but in sickle cell, adenine has replaced that. And so that results in this mutated hemoglobin compared to the normal hemoglobin. That in turn, that change in the hemoglobin protein affects the ability of the red blood cell to take a round phenotype. So instead, where the normal hemoglobin does not aggregate into fibers and can form a normal red blood cell, this hemoglobin does aggregate into fibers and causes these sickle cells to be red blood cells to take form. So this is the phenotype that results from that molecular genetic change. Now, that causes a problem for individuals because normal blood cells can move through blood vessels very freely and they're very flexible and can move through. Sickle cells are not as flexible, and they, because of their odd shape, tend to get stuck very easily, and that can cause pain and damage to organs and prevent blood from getting to certain locations. However, we know from studying this that in certain populations, having the sickle cells can confer resistance to malaria. So, whereas in places like the northern hemisphere, where malaria is much less common because we don't have as many mosquitoes, in places close to the equator, like Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, we tend to see more of the heterozygotes because they have one allele that gives them the sickle cells that confer malaria resistance, but they also have the normal allele that will give them normal blood cells, some normal blood cells that help them prevented from dying from sickle cell. So you can see that heterozygote advantage is favoring two different alleles. Frequency-dependent selection occurs when the fitness of a phenotype depends on how common it is in the population. So, for example, when right-mouthed fish became more common in the population of these scale-eating fish, the prey began to guard their left side, which gave an advantage to the left-mouthed predatory fish. And then when the left-mouthed predatory fish became more common, then that advantage reversed. So you can kind of see it switches back and forth because for a while, one type of fish is going to have the advantage because this prey fish will be guarding the side of the more common individual. But then because it's guarding, this individual doesn't get to eat as much, so this one will get more food, and then they become more common, so the prey will start guarding that side, and it switches back and forth. So that's the frequency-dependent selection. So this kind of keeps the overall frequency of each phenotype close to 50%. The one other type of selection that occurs is sexual selection, and this is natural selection that occurs when the organisms choose individuals based on their ability to mate. So sometimes this will result in something called a sexual dimorphism. So kind of like two different shapes, that's what dimorphism means, or two different characteristics, which are very strong differences in the different sexes in their secondary sex characteristics. So the peacocks are a great example of this. The female peacock, known as the peahen, they look very different than the extravagant male peacocks. And that's because the females a long time ago began to select for these males with these really flashy feathers and all that good stuff. And so that resulted in this selection in the males for this really flashy, and the males that were less flashy kind of have disappeared. Intrasexual selection is competition among individuals of one sex for mates of the opposite sex. So this is kind of like where the males are competing against each other to mate with a female. And then intersexual selection occurs. This is called mate choice. That's when individuals of one sex, usually the females, are choosy in who they select to be their mate. So they're kind of the ones that are choosing. And in this case, when species exhibit intersexual selection, we see a lot of male showiness developing, which when they're more showy, they're more likely to attract a female because the female associates these traits with being healthy and being able to give her lots of babies. But this showiness and this attractiveness, like if you can imagine that big flashy peacock, may decrease his own chances of survival. So he has to kind of pass his genes on quickly. So we think that one of the reasons, like I was mentioning, that these female mate preference has evolved is because of the good genes hypothesis, which would be that if there's certain traits that indicate a male is healthy or has good genes, then the female is going to prefer that trait, and that trait is going to increase in frequency in the population, even if it might draw attention to the male by predators. So once again, as a reminder, natural selection cannot fashion a perfect organism. It can only act on existing variations. And evolution is limited by historical constraints, meaning that it is based on the environment at that time. But should the environment change, the perfect organism would then have to change. So we're never striving for perfection or an ideal. Also important to note that adaptations are often compromises. One adaptation that may be beneficial may result in the loss of adaptations that might be beneficial in a different environment. And then also there's no perfect organism because a lot of it is related to chance. And then also natural selection acts on that chance, but natural selection is acting on that chance because of the way that the environment is at that time. So there's a lot of factors that are involved, and we can never achieve a perfect organism because there's no such thing. When the environment continues to change, then the organisms will also have to continue to change, and natural selection will keep acting on these randomly existing variations in the population for those that can continue to survive and reproduce. And that is the end of population genetics.